The guys are ready, so let's hand over to Rob Rose, JB, PB and Aldrin, and get on with the show.
Welcome to the Club Dub Football Podcast,
where the only question is,
does your team make it into the club?
Can he get in? No, he cannot!
Welcome back, gentlemen.
Hey, Rob.
Hi, Rob.
The draft is over and all we get to do is pick up the pieces, try and reassure those fans who maybe didn't come out of it quite so well that everything will be all right in the end, and try and get excited about teams like the Jets, the Giants, the Lions, who haven't won anything of note in years. All of this to come on what is a bumper-packed show. But really, before we get going, it's really time that we look at our crystal ball-like predictions and talk about the players that we singled out in last week's pre-draft show. So we'll go around our virtual room, talk about the people that we highlighted last week, talk about where they ended up, and whether we think that is a good fit or otherwise. And, you know, habit, tradition dictates. I'm coming to you first, Aldrin. So talk to us about your two starlets and their new home franchises.
Yeah, so I think my first pick last week was Chris Olave, wasn't it? I think I picked him first and then Stingley. So I think Olave landed in a really good spot, actually. The New Orleans Saints traded up from 16 all the way up to 11 to make the selection of Chris Olave. He ended up being the third receiver going in the draft, which I think is pretty fair. I think that's where I had him in that kind of mix. And he lands on a team where he immediately becomes the wide receiver too. You know, he could have easily ended up in an organization where his role was a little more murky, or he'd have to prove himself to be number two. Whereas I think the Saints gives him a really good opportunity to be a number two, potentially even number one receiver, because over the last few years, we've had a lot of those question marks about Michael Thomas, about his fitness, about whether he's, you know, seemingly ever going to play for the Saints again. You know, that was a very legitimate question probably a year ago. And I think, oddly, he ends up in a really good situation quarterback-wise. And I know that might be really odd to say with Jameis Winston being the quarterback there. But ultimately, the failing for Winston is never that it's never on the receivers. You know, it's always his decision making or his poor play. But ultimately, the guy slings it, and he helped some pretty good receivers put up big numbers. You know, I think even Brashad Perriman had a very reasonable year when Winston was there for a bit. So I think he ends up in a really good situation with, you know, a quarterback that's not going to be afraid to throw it, is a little more settled in that organization than maybe some other situations. You know, I'm thinking Panthers, Commanders, you know, there's a few teams where he could have ended up where the quarterback situation was a little more murky. So I think it's pretty clear who the QB1 is in the organization. And I think ultimately he's got a head coach that was raving about him the other night when they were talking about, you know, his intangibles, his hands, the way he plays the game. I think you've got a head coach that is all in on Olave being a really key contributor in that offense. And I think it's going to make them really exciting, because now I think they've got, you know, a pretty reasonable quarterback, you know, not great, not the worst in the league, certainly I wouldn't think. A great running back, a very, very good receiver one, and now he comes in and challenges for that receiver two, receiver one kind of position. So, yeah, I think he's ended up in a really good spot.
I think it says a lot about the Saints and the fact the Saints are certainly not in a rebuilding mode. Like you say, if they'd have picked quarterback or ultimately one or two other positions, if they'd have gone for something to maybe bolster the defense with a number of aging pieces there, you'd have maybe thought about what that means for the direction of the franchise overall. But clearly what you've got there is a coaching staff who believe that they can reboot. The only thing beyond the fact that I think you're right, it absolutely cements Winston as the starting quarterback, is when you talk about Michael Thomas, I mean, it's a little different to us talking about, say, Julio Jones a year ago. But I mean, other than the fact that Thomas is younger, a bit like Julio Jones, we're talking about a wide receiver going into this season a long way removed from his best football. You know, you've got to imagine what I think 1,000-yard, 8 to 10 touchdown season from Michael Thomas probably puts him in the comeback player of the year conversation. You know, with the injuries he's had, if he's able to come back as a true one and a really high production player, then that would be a story in and of itself. But I think you're right. You know, for all the things the Saints do, if you put Winston behind that line, you know the ball is going to be thrown, great running back or not. You know that they're going to have an element of deep threat, an element of, you know, that kind of slot game. And I think Olave fits in really well. I said this last week when you picked him. I've never seen a guy who's got such good hands and that frame be so fast. I mean, he's visually so quick when you watch him. And I think they can be really creative in the way they use him. I think it's a great pick. And we talked about, would he slip to one of those better teams? You know, we talked about him slipping tail end of the first round. The reality is none of the receiver prospects did that. They were all pretty much off the board, weren't they, by the 18th, 20th pick, the really big names. And I think Olave, as you said, is absolutely in that mix. One of the best receivers in the draft, and for me, a good fit.
Yeah. And then, so my second selection was Derek Stingley Jr., who ended up going very high, went third to the Texans. I think actually a really good situation for him. I mean, I certainly feel like the Texans had a heck of a lot of holes to fill and still do. And ultimately, are they going to be a good team this year? That remains to be seen, because quarterback situation, offensive situation, ultimately still a lot of holes on defense. But ultimately, he's ended up in a franchise where he's going to land with a defensive head coach that knows what it's like at the cornerback position, at the back end of the field, and he's going to have absolute confidence in maximizing Stingley's potential. And I think that's kind of what we talked about last week, is that's the critical element, is can you harness Stingley's physical attributes, his game awareness, and everything that you saw on film from 2019 and bring that into reality in the NFL? And I think landing with that kind of defensive head coach, Lovie Smith knows his stuff. He knows defense. And I think Stingley will now be a really critical part of what he looks to build this year, because I do think, you know, I touched on it from the Texans' point of view, but quarterback situation for me is poor there. Offensive weapon situation there is poor. They're going to need to lean on that defense at times throughout this season. And I think landing Stingley gives them a really good chance to have, you know, a potential shutdown corner. And I think you ultimately have to throw him into defensive player of the year, rookie defensive player of the year conversation immediately, because, you know, a guy that goes third in the draft, you expect to be producing. And I think they're really banking on that 2019 film not being an anomaly, and the last 2 years being a bit of a slight blot in terms of injuries. But ultimately, if you can get him back playing to that 2019 tape, and Lovie Smith's the coach, then you give him every shot. So I think, again, a really good situation for him. You know, he was going to go first or second in terms of the cornerbacks that went, and ultimately Sauce Gardner went forward, didn't he, straight after to the Jets. So yeah, time will tell who out of those two is going to be the best, but certainly, you know, he's in a good situation, I think, with that coach.
Yeah, I think my only comments would be kind of, if we're mentioning Sauce, to probably say they're in similar situations, aren't they? Both with good defensive head coaches in Robert Saleh with the Jets and Lovie Smith. And the thing about the Texans is I'm not sure it got lost entirely, but there wasn't a lot wrong with that defense last year. Very physical, a lot of very good individual contributors. The biggest problem that defense had, and the sad reality is it might repeat, history might repeat itself this year as well, is they were just on the field too much. Yeah. You know, if they can get even, you know, half decent quarterback play, I don't think they're adrift. And, you know, we're still in a world where Garoppolo has yet to land. And there are a few things that could immediately change, you know, the Texans' outlook. But I think you're absolutely right with Lovie Smith. particularly with young players, Lovie Smith has this ability to effectively ready them. We talk about those teams who have, rookies who immediately contribute, hit the ground running. And I think Lovie Smith feels like the kind of coach who's got that pedigree. So I love the pick. I mean, it's bold, but I mean, maybe they're looking to next year when, those picks start to tumble in from the Browns and thinking maybe offense or maybe picking that quarterback, whether it's a draft pick or through a trade at some point is some way down the road. I like the building blocks though.
I think one of the things that we kind of lose track of when we're talking about new head coaches, second chance or third chance head coaches, things like that, are kind of what they were able to accomplish in their previous seasons. And let us not forget that Lovie Smith took the Chicago Bears to the Super Bowl off the back of the quarterback play of Rex Grossman. If you can get to the Super Bowl with Rex Grossman, you've got to have a decent idea of how to build a team properly. And obviously the slogan is, offense wins games, defense wins championships. And that Chicago's Bears defense was, I don't want to say what carried them, but it was of that kind of makeup. And you definitely get the impression from Stingley and from kind of a couple of the other picks that they've made in there that's kind of where they're looking at. You think of the Texans and you think of having guys like JJ Watt in there. And I think they're probably thinking, okay, well, that worked once before. Let's get a defensive star and do it all over again.
Yeah, I mean, the Bears, it was Urlacher really, wasn't it, I suppose, who was the beating heart. But you're absolutely right. Interceptosaurus Rex made a Super Bowl, and they put up a pretty good fight, actually, in that Super Bowl for the first half, at least. And, I think Lovie Smith has been a bit unfortunate, really, with the way he's been treated. I think he's certainly proved he can be a top-tier coach with the right pieces, and there are a lot of pieces away, but it feels a solid start. So, Aldrin, if those were your two picks, take us back in time, JB. A week ago, who were you telling us to watch out for in the NFL draft, and what's happened to them since?
So I was talking to everybody about the two best at the time quarterback propositions of the draft in Kenny Pickett and Malik Willis, and did kind of make it all about the Steelers to a degree, but why not? I had the opportunity. And one of the Steelers ended up picking one of them. And I think if I remember correctly, it was the one that I said on paper was maybe the better choice, but it was the one that I didn't want. And talking to PB the day after about the fact that when it came to the Steelers pick and both of them were there and they took Pickett, I couldn't help but feel a little bit disappointed. And obviously partly it's because I wanted the other one, but also because it didn't feel like a wow pick. Like, you've brought Franco Harris on stage to celebrate the anniversary of the Immaculate Reception in the home of the Oakland Raiders, or the Oakland Raiders as they were then, the Las Vegas Raiders as they are now. And then wheeling out Pickett kind of felt a little bit underwhelming. But we'll talk about Willis in a little bit. From the Pickett point of view, overall, it does make sense. I think the Steelers wanted a guy who would be able to come in and potentially challenge for a starting role immediately and really show that he's capable of leading the organization forward. And yes, admittedly, going into a competition against Mitchell Trubisky and Mason Rudolph and being the best of those is kind of like being on top of a pile of something. You're great, but you're still on a pile of something. But I am quite excited about Pickett. I think there's a lot to be excited about on there, and I do think he's got the potential within him to be a fantastic quarterback and be a franchise quarterback. And obviously the Steelers think that because, as Mike Tomlin said in his presser after it, they went kind of all around the country looking at prospects and ended up with the guy next door because he said he's played in, I was about to say Three Rivers there. That's going back away. He's played at Heinz Field repeatedly. They've seen him master the elements and stuff there, which is obviously a big concern when you have the smallest hands in the league. So I'm quite positive about it. My feeling on Malik Willis...
I think just jumping in on that one, I think it's actually a pretty good pick because, one of you one of you kind of NFL elders may have to tell me whether this has happened before, but he's going into a team, his first professional team, playing where he played his college football, right? So he's not going into unfamiliar surroundings and having to deal with all of that whilst trying to get up to speed on the pro game. He'll feel comfortable at Heinz Field because he's played there. You kind of think he's familiar with the surroundings, what it's like on a game day, the weather conditions and all that kind of stuff. So actually, I think that's probably a bonus. And, I've got absolutely no idea whether that played a part in their pick of him, but it wouldn't surprise me to have played a part in it. So actually, I think, they're picking the local guy. It almost has that kind of feel-good pick about it. With Trubisky, I mean, for all it's said, I mean, this is a Trubisky that took the Bears to the playoffs. So I know he gets a lot of criticism, but actually I think he's a solid, solid if unspectacular quarterback. With Trubisky there, Pickett doesn't have to come in and start straight away, so if he comes in training camp and blows people away, then he'll be starting week 1. But I think if he comes in and, he's raw and kind of needs some polishing, then I think Trubisky will start and Pickett will sit until such a point that he's ready. So I think it's a decent pick.
I think the only point I want to add is you mentioned, had it happened before, being a Cardinals fan, I can only think of, in fact, there's a link to you here, Phil, because you bought me a signed Jake Plummer helmet for Christmas. Lovely gift it was. But Jake Plummer was a Sun Devil and then effectively played his home games back then, at least, with the Cardinals in the same stadium. And up until his rookie deal ended and he found his way over to Denver, I think everyone kind of thinks, certainly in that period, he was one of the better quarterbacks the Cardinals had in their history, really. So, yeah, maybe it is. And also something a fan base can be excited about. I know, JB, you mentioned it wasn't the pick you wanted, but I think because we're remote, we follow these teams from across the ocean. If you are a Pittsburgh native and you've seen the college quarterback you cheer for on a Saturday join the NFL team, you cheer for on a Sunday, you can imagine that, that might be a fan-pleasing pick in that regard. I mean, you were going to talk about, Malik Willis, and there's a lot to talk about there. But I don't think it feels like a bad pick considering you're moving on from Big Ben. You've got some options this year.
I think it's a good pick, and I've got hope that it will turn out to be a great one. And just as Phil was calling himself for being elders, we'll cue up the bread music while I just talk about when the Seahawks were eliminated from the playoffs in 2012. People were surprised because Russell Wilson was at the Super Bowl that year. And when he was asked why he was there, it's like, well, we're going to get back here next year, and I don't want it to be a surprise what the atmosphere is like. So he went to that Super Bowl with the understanding of kind of doing a little bit of what Phil was talking about there, understanding the atmosphere, getting kind of used to the pomp and circumstance and the ceremony of everything. So when he goes back in 2013, which he did, he's prepared for it, which he was, and they win, which they did. Moving from Russell Wilson to another skilled, potentially undervalued third round pick, Malik Willis dropping into that was very telling, and they were talking about it a lot on the NFL Network draft broadcast that I watched. Kind of the surprise with the number of trades that happen of people jumping ahead of other teams with quarterback needs, assumedly, jumping ahead and not picking quarterbacks. And it kind of maybe says a lot about what teams actually thought of this draft. Like I talked last week about Willis being a contender for the first quarterback selected. And not only was he not the first quarterback selected, he wasn't the second either. Willis going to the Titans is very interesting because, again, you ask the question of what kind of team are the Titans trying to set themselves up to be. We've all seen grumpy Mike Vrabel talking about how A.J. Brown's absolutely not going to be traded and he's definitely going to be a Tennessee Titan. And then grumpy Mike Vrabel having to answer questions about why A.J. Brown's just been traded and the Titans have drafted A.J. Brown, because that was the comparison, again, Daniel Jeremiah of NFL Network made. Who are they? Because their setup at the moment is feed the ball to Derrick Henry, run off a play action thing, which is kind of where I was about to say Ryan Tannehill succeeds, and that kind of, I almost feel like I need to take a shower after I said that, because it may be more accurate is that's where Ryan Tannehill doesn't fail. But Malik Willis doesn't seem to fit that kind of mold. He's more of an active quarterback. So are they trying to utilize the run even more by potentially running the quarterback as well? Are we going to see a similar thing to what the 49ers have done? Are we going to have like Willis packages this season for him to come in and use his admittedly dynamic athleticism at times when maybe Tannehill just doesn't have that kind of his spring in his step anymore to do anything from it? I think it was an interesting thing. We weren't really talking about the Titans as a team to pick a quarterback. So even going for Willis was a bit of a surprise, and you have to wonder if maybe they're looking to the future instead of the now.
Do you not just think, I at the end of the first round of the draft, one of the headlines, like you say on the NFL Network, was how far will Willis fall in the second round? And I think people imagined he might go 10, 15, 20 picks in the second round. By the time he's fallen to the third, the thing about a third round pick is what? In 3 years, only half of the players selected in the NFL draft third round will still be in the NFL. It's a kind of literally the pick that is 50-50 split almost. And do you not just think there's an element of he has such huge amounts of upside? Why not? Why not take him with the third round pick? He just feels like he'd fallen that far. Did he not just offer there were some people who talked about him going to the Lions with one of their first round picks or one of the early first round picks. They were picking second, weren't they in the end? But to go third, do you not just think it was, why not? It doesn't have to be part of the long-term plan, but he could be a diamond in the rough type find.
Maybe, but given the amount of depth there was for other position groups that the Titans were suffering, if it was literally a let's just spend a third round pick and see what you get, if I was a Titans fan, I would have probably wanted them to have taken a shot on a different group.
I think, so for me on the Malik Willis thing, I'm with you, Rob. Third round, he's there. Who cares? Like, the pick is neither here nor there. Like you say, third round pick can make it or not. If there's a quarterback with incredible physical traits that might turn out to be a really good NFL player, then I think it's worth the pick at 3 in the third round. To your point, JB, knowing what the organization is, well, you can't run Derrick Henry forever. And once that train runs out, Ryan Tannehill isn't the answer. I think Ryan Tannehill's done a tremendous job for the Titans, but he's a game manager at best, really. I think he's not shown that he's the guy that's going to win them games, as evidenced, in the playoffs. So if Derrick Henry isn't at full fettle, then I think they become a very bang average offense. So taking a punt on Malik Willis for maybe 2 years down the line when he might jump in and could potentially be a game-breaking talent, third round pick. I actually think that's, it's not a bad situation for him. And Pickett, yeah, I don't think it's a bad, terrible pick for the Steelers. I do think, though, I don't know, it feels like if you look at how the draft went for quarterbacks, almost feels like the Steelers could have got him in round 2. It feels like potentially you could, if the Steelers didn't go for a quarterback, I don't think anybody would have in that draft. And I do think it says maybe a lot about where the draft class sits. Top players like Matt Howell, went in round 5, 6. There was good quarterbacks from pretty good programs that went late. So yeah, I'm really yet to be sold by this year's draft class, and I think time will tell. But the fact that only one went in the first round says an awful lot about, maybe where people view this draft class. But yeah, I think the Steelers needed a quarterback. Pickett was the best one available. Yeah, there's a bit of that home field buzz, but also the guy's got the most experience out of that draft class. A 5-year, 4-year starter. knows the turf, knows the weather, like you said. It is a
Weather
factor in
shout.
Pittsburgh.
Yeah, the weather was a good shout.
So I like that. And ultimately he might, from everything I've seen, he's not got a tremendous cannon of an arm, but he'll move the chains effectively. And it might be that, you want a game manager when you drafted a top quality running back last year. You get a few more wide receivers like the Steelers often do in the draft, find them late and they turn out to be really good picks. And I think they did that again. So yeah, I don't mind the landing spot for either, actually.
The one quick point that you made, JB, I think is a great one, is about will there be packages for Willis in Tennessee as well? I hadn't really thought that way. But when you've got Henry and, potentially questions of what's going to be done at receiver, that is an interesting one. Short yardage situations, is there like a Cam Newton style package? Even, dare I say it, like a Tim Tebow style package from his time at the Jets. I hadn't thought that way at all, but I love that. Yeah, I love that. PB.
Taysom Hill.
Why not? If Taysom Hill's worth I don't know how much the Saints might be regretting that now, but if he's worth that kind of money, and you know what? The red zone's where people earn money. If you can make it happen in the red zone, you'll have yourself an NFL career. And PB, take us back in time a week. Who were you talking about and why? And tell us where they now call home.
So for me, if you remember last week, I had the 6th and 7th names for us to talk about ahead of the draft. And number 6 overall went Ike Ekwonu. And then number 7th overall went Evan Neal. So the two guys I talked about ended up going in the 2 spots I talked about them in, which is quite funny. If I only put some money on that, but I was too busy looking at the length of the national anthem. Ekwonu, I think at Carolina, he'll slot straight in on day one. He gives them a great, a solid body and a great mover over on the left tackle position. They've got Taylor Motton starting on the right tackle. I think it beefs up their offensive line, which is something they needed to do. Obviously, they're still a little bit up in the air in terms of quarterback. They've McAdoo's named Darnold as the starter, and then kind of walks back on that. But it looks like Darnold will be the starter. So they need to protect him more, because the more pressure he gets, the more, he gets a bit wild with his throws and throws some stupid picks and stuff. So I think it was a position of need. There was a lot of talk about them potentially taking a quarterback, but I think as Aldrin said, it's not been the most high profile quarterback class, of recent years. So there probably wasn't a stellar star that you'd want to really go out and get. So I think they've addressed, it's almost best player available, isn't it? Address the position that you need to. And I think they've done that. Likewise, the New York Giants, I think, had a great draft, to be honest. One of the winners in terms of some of the positions that they've picked. And obviously having the 5th and the 7th pick gives you that flexibility. But if you told them, pre-draft that that Thibodeau will be there at 5 for you, and you're able to draft one of the best edge rushers in the class, and then Evan Neal is there at 7, and you can take one of the best offensive tackles in the class, they'd have probably bitten your hand off. So again, I think it's a real position of need for them. Obviously, the Giants declined Daniel Jones's 5th-year option, so it's a big year. If they are looking to potentially stick with him for the future, he needs a big year for them to either tag him or pay him at the end of this season. Now, Daniel Jones is yet to play all 16 games in the season, because their offensive line's had a lot of holes in it over the last few years. So I think this gives them a real chance to protect him and really give him the opportunity to show what he can do if he is a high level or even a mid-level NFL caliber starter, and we've all got our own opinions on that, as the kind of fantasy bet that took place last year between him and Roethlisberger, between Rob and James. But I think the Giants had a great draft. I think the Neal pick is a great pick. I think the Ekwonu pick is a great pick for Carolina. They both went in the top 10 as we probably expected them to go. So happy with my picks, and I think they'll probably be happy where they landed and walking into a position where they can start week 1.
Really quickly for me, I think just to tie the last two together, I think Carolina not taking a quarterback really reinforces your point, Aldrin, about what was felt about this class. Less so for the Giants, even not picking up Daniel Jones's option, because Brian Daboll's a first-year head coach. You've got to think he'll be given time. Maybe Matt Rule will be given time, but there was a point where I thought that the ceiling for Carolina was, so high. I thought Matt Rule was one of the most exciting coaches to come out of college football in some time. And that just feels like it's really lost its way, really, as a project in Carolina. So when the Panthers aren't swinging for a quarterback and they're sticking with Sam Darnold, who I remain relatively high on, I think it tells you all you need to know. That is a coaching staff under a bit of pressure, and maybe Ben McAdoo will prove me wrong, but I'm kind of amazed to see him land there and really the Panthers to be in the situation they're in. Conversely, your points about teams having a great draft, I think you're absolutely right about the Giants. They solidify in a good position. They're starting to put in those important pieces, those pillars of the team on the offensive side. And, a pass rusher in that division, you've got mobile quarterbacks on a number of... I just really like the pick and what the Giants are doing particularly. So, pretty much agree with everything you've said, to be fair. Long way of saying it, but that's kind of where I end up.
For me... go on, JV. Go on, you go.
No, it's okay. I'll go last.
Okay. Well, for me, Ekwonu's a brilliant shout. I think we talked about it last week when you mentioned him, Phil, that the guy is an exceptional run blocker, particularly, and he's going to need to learn his way in the passing game a little bit, just neaten up his hands and stuff. But as a run blocker, he is an absolute behemoth, and I think that plays really into Carolina's strengths. They want to get Christian McCaffrey back on the field and make him a key part of that offense, because with the quarterback situation as it is, you need that run game to be popping, because what you see at the Titans, the quarterback play doesn't have to be exceptional if the run game is so fearsome and takes players away from other positions. So yeah, I think that's a brilliant pick. The Giants, I think, Neal is an incredible player. Again, an absolute giant. And I think the Giants had a great draft overall, got the best players that were available to them at exactly the right points and filled holes where they needed to. So Neal, I think, slots in really.
So I think the Panthers got the better of the two. I think him slipping to them at 6 is fantastic, and it is almost one of those situations where the Panthers, I don't want to say they failed upwards, but just because of everything else, everything sort of lined up to give them what they want. When we're talking about the Panthers not picking a quarterback, what I'm assuming is we're talking about the Panthers not taking a quarterback in the first round, because the Panthers did pick a quarterback. They took Matt Carroll in the 3rd. And if we apply our Malik Willis logic to Matt Carroll, it's the same kind of thing. It's a 3rd round pick on a guy. Let's take a punt and see how he does. The only problem with that is the Panthers are probably a poorer team overall than the Titans are. So again, you'd ask yourself the question of, are you making the most of the minimal ones that you've got? The engine for that Carolina Panthers team for years now has always been Christian McCaffrey. And we haven't really seen that in the Matt Rule era because he's been injured quite a lot. And it's one of those situations where you need to protect him. And I think we are dangerously close to seeing an Andrew Luck situation with the Panthers and McCaffrey. If they can't do a better job of run blocking for him and keeping him untouched, they're going to lose him completely, like the Colts lost Andrew Luck all those years ago. The Giants did very well in the draft, and the Giants improved their team in the draft. Incredibly difficult for the Giants to not have got better, because overall they're a terrible team. They made the right choices, though. I think it's interesting to see them not do anything about the quarterback and it's interesting to see them not pick up Daniel Jones's 5th-year option, but essentially build a team that's structured around having a solid offensive line. So it kind of asks the question of, well, is Jones the guy or isn't he the guy? What are you attempting to do here? You can't argue with the pick. Like Evan Neal is absolutely fantastic. So I don't know. It's very up in the air for me.
So the point I was making about Carolina is exactly what you've crystallized. My point wasn't that you are right. I said didn't take a quarterback. What I was meaning by that was they had a pick that allowed them any quarterback in the draft, and they didn't pick a quarterback was my kind of point. And again, if you're picking a quarterback in the 3rd round, I don't know, is Russell Wilson in that 3rd round somewhere? Is there a superstar in that 3rd round? Because if the class is as underwhelming as clearly NFL scouts and NFL front offices believe, I just think Matt Rule's under a bit of pressure, probably quite a lot of pressure. I think he starts the year on the hot seat, if I'm honest. And I think it's a good pick, but I wonder if it'll be a good pick that'll benefit the next head coach rather than Matt Rule. Could be horribly wrong. So does that mean we're round to me? Well, mine, I kind of listening back to our pod ended up talking about 7 or 8 kind of offensive linemen and edge rushers and outside linebackers and all sorts. But one of the players I mentioned last week has already been spoken about because it was Thibodeau going to the Giants, which, as I've said, I think them having some form of pass rush is really positive for them. I know they had Marcus Golden a few years ago from the Cardinals who didn't work out and found his way back to Arizona. But I think just having somebody who is disruptive, it's been a while now for the Giants, probably since those Super Bowl era teams where you had the kind of players that could really put opposing quarterbacks under significant and serious pressure. So I love that. The other one to talk about is probably Aiden Hutchinson going second. There's a little bit of a storybook ending there because he gets to stay in Michigan. He gets to go to the Lions, which was a really kind of nice kind of tale to tell. But the thing I think that's probably more noteworthy with the players I talked about is I mentioned last week, does Jacksonville pass up on Aiden Hutchinson? Do they pick Trayvon Walker? And Aldrin, you were astounded at the thought of this. It was like nonsense, right? How do you pass up clearly the best player in college football for a guy who has got not incredible, not kind of jumping off the page college stats? I mean, Trayvon Walker is, looks like the Incredible Hulk. I mean, the guy's, an absolute specimen, got all the physical attributes to be a great player, but he wasn't necessarily that great player in college. So as much as Hutchinson gets, I don't know, like I say, that absolute, fairy tale ending going to the Lions, and I think makes them an awful lot better. I am a little bit surprised by the Jags, going for Walker. I thought Hutchinson was more pro-ready and probably just a better player for me. I just don't quite see what puts Walker above him. But yeah, I don't know. Is there something I'm missing with Trayvon Walker because I'm just not quite seeing the appeal?
So no, because I'm kind of with you on this. And interestingly enough, I tried to be an actual professional podcaster and make notes as the draft was going on to bring them for discussion points here. Made notes about Aiden Hutchinson and then put my phone down and never picked it back up again to do the same for anybody else.
Finished on pick 2. Good work. I like
it was great. Didn't even start on pick 1. It was literally just pick 2 and that was it. But there was a reason for it, and I think much gets made of a lot of the, and I'm going to use it again, the pomp and circumstance of the draft. Kind of you have the green room backstage with everyone with their families, and you have the pick walking through the, the corridors. And this year, had them try the hat on with a mirror so they could see themselves and the camera could see them trying it on and everything. And you go through this every couple of years. And there was a pick last year. I won't name names, but he was a bit of a Mac of all trades, picked up by one of the AFC teams, who, as he's walking out, just looked like a bit of a jobber. And you kind of look and thinking, I'm not sure I'd have much faith in this guy. Aiden Hutchinson looked like an absolute star. everything about him screamed, I'm a big deal. I am massive in this sport. I will be amazing. And if the Lions can translate any of that look into actual substance, they've made the absolute best pick in this draft, which I know is an obvious thing to say when you pick in second, but at the same time, like Rob's kind of saying, the Jags picked first. Why did they let him go past? This guy looked like he was going to be dangerous, and like we talked about when we were talking about Stingley for Aldrin's segment, he's the kind of guy that you can have as your, not just your defensive star, but kind of the player that you build everything around. You have that cornerstone piece now. Maybe that's what the Giants have been the Lions have been missing. I will say from a Giants point of view, and maybe undoing a little bit of what I said previously, when you think about those pairs of Super Bowls that the Giants have won, it was off the back of Lawrence Taylor and Carl Banks and Michael Strahan and Justin Tuck. It's a dominating defense that really carried them to what they were able to do there. And you've got to look at, and here we go, ladies and gentlemen, Thibodeau, yeah. You got to look at him as harking back to that kind of the New York sack exchange. Was that them or was that the Jets? Gonna get thinged if that was wrong. But looking at and getting that kind of defensive performance from it. So
I love that. JPP. They have had great defensive players, but it's a defense that's been devoid of those kind of stars. And the only thing for me before we talk a bit trades, I talked obviously about David Ajabu being obviously a bit of relatively local interest, a British player, Nigerian-born Scotsman. He ends up at the Ravens, I think, 13th pick of the second round. And regardless of where he got picked, I actually think just a really good fit. I think John Harbaugh, despite the fact, he's a special teams coach in essence, wasn't he, to come through the ranks, one of those rare occasions where a special teams coordinator became a head coach. But every phase of the Ravens is just brilliantly coached. You feel like even if they start the year, they have significant injuries. And they had more injuries last season than any team in NFL history at one point. But they always have players who seem ready to play on the Sunday. And I think for a guy who is raw and a guy who has attributes, but not necessarily the know-how and the schooling that comes with, spending, long periods of time learning the science behind the game, I think he's landed in an absolutely brilliant spot. Probably similar to Walker in a way, but it's a second round pick against first overall for me. So it's a no-brainer for the Ravens.
So with him as well, doesn't he end up, I know at the Ravens, but isn't the defensive coordinator for the Ravens also the guy that was the defensive coordinator for Michigan? So he coached Ajabu, didn't he, at college level? And I think that's a brilliant fit. The guy is going to miss a chunk of this season anyway, isn't he? So I think what better head coach and what better organization to be in to learn, all the facets of defense than that route.
Yeah, completely agree. And so with that being our kind of, pick of our highlights, the swings and a couple of misses. Last point before we get on to trades, I just think Jacksonville, I remember when the Cardinals picked Kyler Murray and Steve Keim was interviewed and they said, are you excited about having the first overall pick? And I always liked, I'm not always Steve Keim's biggest fan, but always liked his response. He said, I'm not excited, I'm embarrassed. The idea is you have to pick the best player so you're never back here again. I just think the Jags, I don't know. I hope it works out for them because they've got a great fan base over here in the UK and it's always good fun when the Jags are kind of really performing. But I don't know, it just doesn't feel like the kind of pick that should be surefire, should be an absolute lock as JB was describing. So when we finished the pod last week, we talked about the fact that we wanted...
Just before we cover off the draft, because we've not mentioned any of their picks really, I think the Jets had a great draft. And
agreed.
It's not something that, we often say about the Jets in terms of having, a high-performing front office or anything like that. But you can argue that they got the first cornerback, the first wide receiver, the third best edge, the best running back, and maybe the second best tight end in the draft. So, I think they've really addressed a number of skill positions, on top of picking up, Zach Wilson last year. I think they're in a tough division, so it's always going to be tough, but I think they should show a marked improvement this year. If you think that Salah is a really good coach, as he was deemed to be, with the players that they've picked, you'd expect an improvement year 2 this year. So I can see them, performing way above where they have over the last few years.
Who would have thought that when you're a terrible franchise, all you need to do is be terrible for years so that you get 50 picks in a draft and then you can just pick loads of good players? I mean, who would have
guessed?
It's
a bold strategy.
See if it works out for him.
I got there before I could. No, I think I agree with Phil. I think the Jets had a really, really good draft, and almost not intentionally. Obviously, I think they intentionally set out to get those players, but I think if you'd have said to Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh and kind of the Johnson family that, your 4 picks, you're going to get all the ones that you want, they were going to kind of like, you've been drinking? Are you crazy? But personally, I think if you had potentially made some kind of wager with your friends about the Jets successfully going to the playoffs within a certain amount of time, based on that draft performance, you would feel pretty good about yourself right now.
Yep, Seattle Seahawks bet away from a good night's sleep, aren't you, JB? It's a pity that.
Before we move away, I know we've touched on, Phil wanted to touch on somebody that had a great draft. Can I talk about a team that I think had an absolute stinker? And I mean, I could well be proved wrong by the greatest coach of the NFL era.
Yeah.
But what on earth are the Patriots doing? Like, where are they getting? Who are they scouting? What was Cole Strange? Did you see the Saints guys that were like, oh, he's gone. We were going to pick him in the 5th.
No, that was the Rams. And I think that...
Rams, sorry. Yeah, let's...
No. I think, on the one hand, it is funny and it appears to be such a reach. But on the other hand, it's all well and good Sean McVay having a laugh at the Patriots' expense and it's all funny. But you've got a guy who's worked his butt off to get drafted. He's just been drafted in the first round and all he's going to see is this soundbite of the Super Bowl winning NFL coach laughing because he was picked so high. And I thought, what a classless move, from Sean McVay. Like, the more I see of him, it is absolute trash as a character. Shame on you, Sean McVay.
You'd never guess that Phil doesn't like Sean McVay. I don't think it was that bad because they'd scouted him. They knew who he was. I just think you don't expect a guy from Chattanooga to be drafted in the first round. Certainly not that high. So, I don't think it was that bad. I do think it's a surprise when you're watching it as in real time. Anybody was like, what are they doing? So for me, it did feel quite a natural reaction to be surprised that they've leapt up and gone and got him. But I mean, just all of the draft seems odd. And again, Belichick could quite comfortably prove me wrong. And these guys turn out to be Pro Bowl players for years and years, leave the Patriots, get a massive payday and turn out to be terrible players. But
Wait 4 years.
Just...
Wait 4 years till the Giants pay him a 5-year, $90 million guaranteed contract. Yeah, just wait. The Patriots. Sean McVay even being talked about in the NFL draft to me is a travesty. That guy's giving away all his picks. He does not deserve to be newsworthy. What are they doing in that war room for the first 4 rounds? Just how on earth Sean McVay has even made this pod.
That's the only reason they know who Cole Strange was, because they were looking for 5th round picks.
Sorry, JB.
That's right. Just while we're talking about baffling draft strategies, the other one that I was kind of going to go with was the Green Bay Packers. Because again, we're talking about they traded away Devontae Adams. They let go almost all of their other wide receivers. So the top of their depth chart now is Alan Lazard. Everything has been made of how little they have given Aaron Rodgers in the first round of the draft. They have 2 first-round picks, and they go defense with both of them. Yes, they traded up to get a wide receiver at the top of the beginning of the second, but just why?
I mean,
Didn't they
part of the
also
answer...
didn't they get Bailey Zapp in the 4th round, like a quarterback from Kentucky? Right. I don't know. All of it was weird.
I mean, it all comes back to Aaron Rodgers, though, isn't it? I mean, part of the problem is they're paying him a huge amount of money, which means they can't pay a lot of their other star names money. And then the other thing is, you've got to imagine, I don't agree with it, that they believe that Rodgers can work with almost anything, that he can elevate, the players around him to the point where actually if they can form a formidable defense, they should be competitive again. I don't know. I think without Aaron Rodgers, as much as I think he's played his face and been a really polarizing character the last year or two, even with Green Bay fans, I think without him, that roster is beginning to look a bit ordinary, isn't it? I mean, that's the only thing I can think, the only plan I can maybe describe. But yeah, I think if he does retire at the end of this season, that is going to be a big pair of shoes to fill. So
go to trades. Sorry, I distracted everyone.
Let's talk trades. I mean, I ended our last pod saying, wouldn't it be great if there was loads of trades? We haven't seen a first round with trades in forever. And then JB, you kind of corrected me because I was kind of talking about draft night trades, I suppose. But we do have to remember, are you ready with this stat, JB? You had this stat in your pocket and I loved it.
I did, but bearing in mind that the stat that I was giving you didn't account for the fact that there was 2 teams involved in each of them. So depending on how we do with this, there's 32 picks in the first round.
Correct.
And there were 27 different teams that touched most of them. And that's a really weird stat. When you look at things, you've got like the Commanders pick at 16 was the Washington Commanders from Indianapolis via Philadelphia and New Orleans. You've got the Falcons pick in 38 in the second round was the Falcons from Carolina via the New York Jets and the New York Giants. Was it the Ravens who traded in? I think this happened on the second day. The Ravens traded in and then immediately traded back out again.
It was trade happy. And I mean, I'll let you guys talk about the slightly bigger news because I think wide receivers called Brown are going to dominate this to an extent. So I'm going to take the man I once refused to call Hollywood Brown, and actually refer to as wide receiver Brown, who the Cardinals took with their first round pick. I mean, as much as they traded their first round pick to Baltimore, they did pick up a third. So it doesn't feel like a true bona fide first round pick they've given away. But obviously in the time since the draft, we've learned a little more about why that makes so much sense to the Cardinals. So on draft night, the arguments were this, that Hollywood Brown had obviously played with Kyler Murray in college. The two had a very strong connection and friendship, actually, that had kind of stayed intact as they'd both moved into the NFL ranks. You then had the fact that Brown is guaranteed $2.1 million both this coming season and next season, which ultimately in the world of wide receivers, as we now understand it, is not a lot of money. I mean, if you're an above average wide receiver, you're probably getting into double digits when it comes to the millions of dollars per season that you might be earning. So I think to take a guy who is a bona fide starter, to put him in Arizona where he would not necessarily need to be the typical number one, not even the typical number two, if we imagine AJ Green will continue to be productive in the Cardinals ranks, and with players like Rondell Moore and with some interesting moves the Cardinals made at tight end, I kind of thought it made sense. A guy who's not a risk, what he can do at the pro level, and he's going to come in and be a contributor in what the Cardinals hope is a high-powered offense. Now, since the trade's gone down, we've obviously learned that DeAndre Hopkins is going to miss the first 6 games of the coming season for issues around performance-enhancing drugs. Now it makes an awful lot more sense. You can't afford to take a risk on a wide receiver, particularly as the really stellar talents are off the board by that point in the first round anyway. And I just think Steve Keim has kind of pulled a rabbit out of that hat, really. I think he's done very good work to make sure the Cardinals can basically reload and try to go again. Whatever the Cardinals fan base might think about the gaps we've got and how far away we are, obviously Steve Keim, Cliff Kingsbury and others believe that with a bit more luck. I mean, I suppose we were the last unbeaten team in the NFL. With less injuries, a bit of luck, maybe we can be a real NFL or NFC, certainly heavyweight. But that was obviously one of two trades. Who wants to take the other one? We've already mentioned it, the Tennessee Titans shipping their WR1. Who wants to pick up on the AJ Brown story and tell me what you think of that?
I'm surprised they did it, to be honest. And from the look of the little video reaction you see afterwards, I'm not sure that Vrabel was particularly happy that they did it either. Kind of walking away, shaking his head, taking a moment. So, yeah, it's a strange one. I think I said on the podcast last week I could see him staying there and then paying him. And then ultimately they've shifted him out to the Eagles. I think it's a good trade for the Eagles. But a bit of an odd one. And then drafting a wide receiver. So we talked about them taking the quarterback later on. Who knows if their thought is that they've picked this star wide receiver, hopefully, and a potential star quarterback, and then they're going to grow together and kind of form the cornerstone of what their offense is going to be over the next kind of 10 years or so. But I thought he'd stay. Real surprise for me to see him traded. And I can't think, aside from the guy they've just drafted, I can't think of any real standout receivers on the Titans now. You're almost looking at a situation like Colts, for example, had last year with no real names on the receiving core. They've lost Julio Jones now, the Titans, in the offseason, albeit he didn't pull up any trees last year. Lost Brown. They lost Davis the year before. Strange move for me.
I think it was weird because didn't he say that they never offered in the region of 20 million? Like that was kind of the cut point. And I think if you're the Titans, you knew that's the benchmark, right? You've seen the Devontae Adams money, you've seen the Tyreek Hill money, and I don't think AJ Brown is in quite that bracket, but you know that the market's been reset. So you know the kind of value you're going to have to pay. And ultimately for a team that's devoid of receiving talent, to not be willing to pay AJ Brown 20 million a season was just bizarre to me because, like you say, Phil, they've got no other receivers. It's not like they're overburdened and could afford to let him go. They've got no receivers. The guy is a real top tier talent, real top tier. I think the stuff that guy does with a very average quarterback and an awful lot of cornerback attention, given that he is the guy and the only guy. I just find it bizarre. I mean, they picked up Treylon Burks, didn't they? And his kind of frame and physicality is similar to AJ Brown. But to your point, Rob, you don't mess around with, getting receivers when you need a receiver to immediately come in and perform. And I think that's kind of where the Titans feel like they are. So it seemed bizarre to me. I mean, it's a very good move for the Eagles. I think they've got a very good wide receiver room now. Well, I say a very good wide receiver. I think they've got two good receivers and then Jalen Reagor. But it makes complete sense to me that the Eagles would have picked him up, give Hurts all the weapons that you can. I think they've got a very good couple of running backs, really. And then now two very top tier wide receivers of different kind of molds as well. I think if you're in a position now where you're kind of pinning that Hurts is the guy for now, can he be the guy moving forward if we give him the pieces? And I think this year will answer that. They've done all that they can do to surround him with talent. So it's up to him now.
I think the quote around Brown, wasn't it, that the Titans needed to get to 21 million and the Titans offered him 16 with incentives to get to 20. And with wide receiver money the way it is now, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, didn't we? You've got to kind of look at it and think, well, the Titans made what they feel was the best choice for them, which is move him on and bring in essentially him again. So just start over and kind of go through that thing. And we'll see if it works out for them. It is absolutely a great decision for the Eagles, though, and it answers a couple of questions. The biggest of all, which is, well, are the Eagles still in on Hurts? And well, yeah, they must be, because like Aldrin's just said, they're kind of giving him more weapons. They're giving him more to deal with now, and pairing up AJ Brown with Devonta Smith, the one at the Eagles, isn't he? Is a fantastic thing. We saw what Smith could do last year with not very good on the opposite side of him. Now with very good on the other side of him, that's an immediate upgrade. And yeah, we're saying like, yeah, the Eagles might not have a great wide receiver room, but they've got two good wide receivers. That's better than the Eagles have had in years. And for me, that kind of trade was quite surprising. I mean, not as surprising as what we immediately expected when the other trade that Rob mentioned went in on Thursday, which was getting to this podcast. And can I just shock you? I like Hollywood Brown, despite what I said earlier.
He's a good wide receiver 3. I'm not sure I have him as a wide receiver 1 anywhere, but for 2.1 million, he's more than welcome. I mean, in this, I mean, as a
3, who do you have as wide receiver 2 then?
Well,
I
AJ
think Rob's
Green?
talking about his talent level. But
You'd not have Brown over AJ Green. I know AJ Green in his prime is 1 or 2, but AJ Green.
I don't know. AJ Green wasn't far off 1,000 yards last season. What, 50 short of 1,000 yards? What was it? 8 touchdowns. I mean, I don't know. I mean, whether Green will still be. I mean, every year is another year older. But I wasn't thinking we needed a wide receiver too. Let's put it that way. I thought we looked like we had Hop, Green, and Rondell Moore, and then by the time, 2 good tight ends, I suppose, arguably maybe even 3 good tight ends now in Arizona as well. But yeah, maybe I'm being a bit harsh on wide receiver Brown. I tell you what, a little.
Just want to come in just to confirm that Adriel Jeremiah Green last season in the regular season, 16 games played, 9 started, 54 receptions for 848 yards and 3 touchdowns. So
feels all right.
Yeah. What did Hollywood do?
Those 3 touchdowns are going to win
your somebody Phil while I just look that up.
He's using the Google machine.
But hang on, what we're also doing is we're doing a thing here. We're comparing the Cardinals with Kyler Murray to the Ravens with running back Jackson.
Irrelevant. We can only go off stats, James. That's
so
what the draft era is around.
2021.
You cannot say that Lamar Jackson is a running back and Kyler Murray is not. They're like the same type of quarterback.
You forget that I'm a Pittsburgh Steelers fan, so of course I can say these things. So last season, Hollywood Brown played 16, started 16 for 91 receptions, 1,008 yards and 6 touchdowns.
Yeah, I think that's like I say, I think the thing that can't get lost is its salary as well with the Cardinals. No cap space. We've got him on 2.1 million this year, 2.1 million next year. That's great value. And yeah, it maybe feels like a loss in a way when you've got a first round pick at, what were we, 23, wherever we were. But yeah, I'm happy overall. I think certainly now the D-Hop situation's gone out. Rolling back one last time to the Eagles, Howie Roseman, wow. If we talk about comeback player, what about comeback GM? I mean, this is the guy in 2019 and 2020 who couldn't get out of his own way. I mean, literally picking second-rate receivers when you've got absolute superstars still left on the board. So what was it? 2019, Arcega Whiteside picked before DK Metcalf. The following year, Rieger before Justin Jefferson. Now, I think Howie Roseman is possibly getting that very passionate Eagles fan base back on board. And I think you're absolutely spot on. The point you made, the thing with the Eagles now is they've got balance. They've got teams that can't afford to absolutely fill the box defensively because they've got great threats on either side at wide receiver, which means your mobile quarterback and potentially even a running back or two can do even more damage. I think the Eagles look pretty interesting pretty quickly. And that, I think, unless there are final thoughts from any of you, is us bringing to a close what felt a really good NFL draft.
I just think Howie Roseman had my favorite moment last year in the draft when he made a selection and everyone in the room actually audibly went, oh.
Shook
and
their
refused.
heads.
Remember the guy refused to shake his hand? He was like, a terrible pick and walked off.
Yeah,
The thing
talk
is,
about Renaissance.
This is the second Rosemanessence.
Yeah, go with that.
Had,
Rosemanessence, yeah.
Because there was when he got moved to the broom cupboard in the Eagles facility when Chip Kelly tried to take over and then came back out of it and rebuilt the Eagles to win the Super Bowl. But the last thing that I want to talk about is, can we please give a shout out and shine a little spotlight on the majesty that is Jerry Jones? Not for the Cowboys' first pick, but for the fact that in his eagerness to prove that that was absolutely who the Cowboys wanted, showed the media the Cowboys draft plan and had to have his son tell him not to do that. Like, there is going to be a point where we don't get Jerry Jones in the NFL anymore, and it is going to be a bit of a sad day for things like this.
I'll agree with you on that. He is box office, for good or for occasionally bad. Nobody else does it quite the same way. So nice. I think our episode a year ago, we did Draftermath. Today we've recorded Draftermath 2. I think this year's draft actually a more interesting draft, probably just because it wasn't dominated by quarterbacks, which leads to a lot more different things going on and teams looking at different angles and ways to improve, which I thought was exciting. We were talking about a couple of years ago how running backs were undervalued. We're probably now in a market where wide receivers are overvalued, and there's still plenty more moving and shaking, I think, before we get to the start of the season, not least because there are teams that need to kind of trim cap numbers and all sorts before that rolls around. But yeah, exciting times. And gentlemen, I think you told the story with the kind of majesty that only comes from some of the greatest punditry on NFL matters. So consider that a job well done. Shall we get back in a week's time and talk about whatever news the NFL has thrown us? If they throw us a bone, we'll try and do something with it.
Yeah,
and bring
somebody will
everyone
get
in
injured, won't they? And Baker Mayfield will be on the move. I mean, I assume as soon as we finish this, Baker Mayfield will have been traded somewhere. That's normally how it goes.
Isn't it schedule release this week?
Yes, Wednesday, the international games are being announced as well. So tomorrow we will hear, we know what the games are rumoured. The rumour is it's going to be Giants at Packers, Broncos at Jags and Vikings at Saints, all in London. And then the initial talk was Chiefs at Buccaneers in Germany. However, that was pre-Brady unretirement. The thought now is that the US market's probably not going to want to give up a prime time Mahomes versus Brady battle. So it looks now like it might be the Seahawks versus the Bucs in Munich. But
can't wait to see. Can't wait to see you travel all the way to Munich to watch Drew Lock throw 4 interceptions. I mean, you'll enjoy it, but
I travelled to London to watch Winston turn the ball over 6 times. So
that's what we can do. That's what we can do next week. We can look at the schedule and work out what games we're going to watch while Phil's in Germany.
All I will say, Phil, is I hope the Germany trip pays off for you. I once travelled in hope and expectation to watch my beloved Cardinals play in London and watch their franchise quarterback get so badly broken he never took another snap in the NFL and watch them fail to score a single point. I mean,
I remember watching that game with you.
Painful memories, dark times. But thank you, gents. Let's get back in 7 days. Do it all again. And remember, you can get in touch with us on our various social channels. Anything you want us to ponder and consider, well, we can very easily hand over to you. Where will Baker be in 7 days indeed? Let's catch up in a week and find out.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks a lot.
This is amazing.
Remember to subscribe and be cool. Tell your friends.
The game is over.